got it, so.
Ready to go? So we will have a few members joining us late, and Member Kiana is going to be absent tonight. Yep, okay. So at the start of the hour, we're going to take the first half hour as we usually do for our workshop. And then promptly at 7:30, we'll start our regular meeting agenda. So with that, Natalie, our city planner, has offered to walk us through a couple of things. One, some legislation being drafted around accessory dwellings. And then going to share some information with us about conversations being had relative to our aquifer. Which one did you want to start with?
Let's start with the local law, since that's a little bit more pertinent right now. So the city council, all these materials should be available online, but I think at the beginning of this year, in January, the council kind of picked up their conversation on actions they could be taking to increase housing supply and affordability of housing within the city. Potential revisions to the accessory apartment regulations was one thing that was kind of a low-hanging fruit, since they're already on the books. Council wanted to kind of take a look at those and see what we could be doing to increase the flexibility of those regulations to allow folks to develop accessory apartments on their parcels. We did also get a memo from former building inspector kind of noting that although I think maybe the planning board sees a few applications every year, I think what Building Inspector Flowers had reported in his memo was that I think we had only seen four ADUs kind of file for building permits in the last 2 years. So we were kind of just looking at how we could increase those numbers, right? So at their February meeting is when the council kind of started discussing the various regulations. And so what I have up is the ADU regulations, and this is the red line version that they decided to circulate to the planning board as well as Dutchess County Planning for comments at their last meeting. So some of the changes, it's actually going to be on this schedule. So in terms of the use table, accessory apartments are a listed accessory use. Previously, they were permitted just in the R1, RD, and T districts. What the council decided was if there is a single-family home, which we do have examples of single-family homes in other districts that are either maybe they've just been there longer or single-family is permitted, that if wherever there is a single-family parcel, there could be an accessory dwelling unit on that. So basically permitted across the board as long as it's on a parcel with a single family residence. You can't have more than one residence and one accessory apartment on a parcel.
Question.
Yes.
How would that in theory apply to light and high industrial?
If there is a residential unit, or if there's a residential parcel within one of those zoning districts. Because the zoning districts are based usually on the typical form, right? The typical uses and form within an area, but they are never 100, they're not usually 100% of all the units, or all the parcels. So the next change that the council is considering, they did consider there is a requirement that accessory apartments or the primary residence be occupied by the primary property owner. The council has decided to maintain that regulation for now. One of the other changes we discussed was minimum and maximum sizes. So the code currently has a minimum square footage of 200 square feet and a maximum of 1,000. The council has decided to remove the minimum square footage and allow the building code, which already has kind of minimum sizes for dwelling units, to be the governing factor with that. So as the New York State Building Code kind of evolves, and we allow for maybe smaller units or more kind of what's micro units is a term, that be the deciding factor of minimum size.
Does it make sense to have that 50% of the, because it's moving over to that 50% of the footprint threshold to require planning board approval?
Yep, I'm almost there.
I was going to say, does it make sense to do that? So,
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so minimum removed, right? The 200 square foot minimum, and now the New York State Building Code would govern. The maximum used to be 1,000 square feet as a maximum. What the council has decided is to remove that kind of static number of 1,000 square feet And what they are now proposing, and this is one of the big pieces, I think, is what Kevin's getting at, that the council is asking for the planning board's feedback on, is instead the governing factor would be if your most accessory units should be 50% of the primary residence size or less, right? If you are in some kind of special circumstance where you feel like your accessory apartment needs to be bigger than 50% of the primary unit, that would require planning board approval. And where we're going to go with this as we get lower down is the council has also made some moves to try and make accessory apartments permitted by right in a number of cases, or permitted with just the building permit. So this is one factor that would still remain in front of the planning board if there is if it is greater than 50% of the primary building's footprint. Is that so? Did you have a question on that?
No, it was just a feature of it that stuck out, and you were
Yeah.
getting to that point.
Yeah. So I'll keep going through, and I think we can, and then there was
Can I
a
ask
few
a quick,
pieces that they specifically wanted the,
On that point, if I can just ask a quick question.
Yeah.
So there seems like there's been dialogue evolving in the city about the design of infill housing in historic neighborhoods. For an accessory dwelling unit, less than 50% of the primary residence square footage, what would be the review for the design of the accessory dwelling unit if it was a new structure?
there are no stipulations on the design. I don't think there currently are. I guess maybe let's talk about what happens if it is in it's an HDLO property.
Sure. I mean, as a starter, but I mean, just,
If it wasn't a historic designated property, I don't think there's any regulations in the code right now that even govern at least not in the accessory apartment section of the code. There's no design regulations.
so John, in the past, we have seen some, we've had applications for accessory dwelling units where we've looked at site plan, and we've also looked at the design of whether it was a renovation of an existing garage or a new building, and comments have been made. And so I'm kind of saying, if this is only going to come before the planning board, if it's greater than 50% of the primary dwelling, are we concerned about running into situations where the style of the ADU is, maybe there's an opinion that it's not compatible with the historic fabric of the neighborhood? It's kind of becoming,
Yep.
Infill.
Yeah,
You would still have ARB approval though, right? Building permit would have to be issued.
so that's one of the things I'm curious about
Just
too.
like site plan.
What the
'Cause I
threshold
thought it was
is.
both,
Yeah.
was the ARB also 50% or?
This says that there's some more sections where the ARB comes in.
Why don't we go through all of the
Okay.
suggested changes, and then we'll come back to the board and we'll sort of get to questions, so that you can kind of run through them.
Yeah, because I think there are some areas where they come back to the ARB, but let's flag that as, because that's specifically the points that the council's looking for you guys' input on.
Yeah.
So one of the other proposed changes, right now the code allows for an existing structure that does not conform to the existing yard requirements. So if you had a garage or a carriage house or something that is kind of within the side yard setbacks, right now the code does say that you do not need a variance from the Zoning Board of Appeals for that, if it's an existing structure, right? As long as you are not proposing to enlarge or increase the dimensional nonconformity. A section that has now been added to that is, however, an application to the city's, I think the official name is Architectural and Community Appearance Board of Review, or the ARB, shall be required if the proposed use is less than 10 feet from the property line or within 20 feet of any dwelling unit on an adjacent property, and the ARB shall consider bulk, height, window placement, and other design feature considerations to minimize visual, aesthetic, and quality of life impacts associated with the accessory apartment being located in such close kind of proximity to the item set above, right?
Yep, so quick question there, just since we're tracking to this idea of the existing non-conforming, right? So
Yeah.
what you just described would apply to.
Specifically to existing structures.
Non-conforming.
Yeah.
If there's a situation where And it just sounds like the answer is going to be, yeah, but if there's a situation where they're looking to build new accessory, non-conforming, requiring a variance, it would
Or
then also
convert-
fall under the.
Yeah. If they're
Or-
looking
or
to
convert into
or
a
convert,
garage.
like I think we had one a little while ago that was a garage, and they were converting a portion of the garage, or maybe it was the entire garage, into an accessory apartment, and it was within the setback. But so this section of the code allowed it to not have to go to the ZBA because even though it was 5 feet rather than 10 feet, right? This is a new section that's added there that says, okay, but in that case, maybe the ARB should be taking a look at windows, how the unit's being set up inside the existing structure. So what the conversation was is not wanting, okay, so this is an existing structure that used to just house cars, and now it's going to be housing people, and the windows like staring right into my backyard or right into my house. So this is kind of an additional level of review that the council has added
Got it.
for those existing structures.
Okay.
Can I just add something? So my question was going to be, why do we need to specifically call out this particular instance where the accessory dwelling unit would be coming to the ARB for review? Don't all building permits have to come to the ARB for review? That's not true. Yeah, so I just double checked in chapter 86. It's only building permits for structures in excess of 1,000 square feet come to you under ARB. So if you're building something less than 1,000 square feet, it doesn't need ARB approval. So if there's any potential for accessory dwelling units to be less than.
So accessory apartments were not coming before this body for ARB review previously because they were always less than 1,000 square feet.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, right, so there's the ability for somebody to come with a 999 square foot ugly thing and skirt the planning board of the ARB altogether. Right? If people are
That's existing,
deliberately
yeah.
Looking to build something ugly.
Bear in mind, this hasn't been a problem over the past 20 years, this has been on the books, but.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but,
fair.
Yeah.
But, the one thing I wanted to, no, sorry.
Please, yeah,
oh,
go ahead. Well, so,
Moving from 200 to 1,000 feet to 50%. Like I said, that was one of the things that really gave me the most pause here because it made me stop and think, what is the actual objective we're trying to achieve here? The 50% limitation, that seems to serve the purpose of regulating relative bulk and making sure that a quote accessory building is not going to be more than half the footprint of the building on the lot in terms of regulating the actual size of the building. I mean, if I have a single level ranch that's 4,000 square feet, I can build a pretty big, I can build an accessory apartment that's bigger than a lot of people's houses under this standard. If the purpose that's actually being targeted here is to increase the stock of affordable housing, then it would seem to me that you'd want to put dimensional limitations on it that would be across the board consistent with that, regardless of what the footprint of the primary residence is. And obviously, the concern about bulk is a concern, but that was really one of the big thoughts I had is, do we, if the goal here is increasing the stock of more reasonably priced housing units, do we want to force people to not build things that are very big?
I don't think that this is actually a debate amongst planners about whether accessory apartments are often affordable, and unless they are regulated by some kind of funding mechanism, I don't think they typically are affordable units. They cost a lot of money to build. So when you're talking about the affordability of an accessory apartment, you're typically talking about the affordability that it offers to the primary property owner, and that they can stay in their home because they now have an income source on their property. There are, if you're doing a really smaller micro unit in your backyard, then yes, you probably would charge relatively less for that than you would for a 2,000, in your example, a 2,000 square foot accessory apartment. But I just want to, I think when we're talking about affordability of accessory apartments, I think it's both to the property, it's affordability with the primary property owner, as well as potentially the accessory apartment. So I think it's those two factors. And I think, what the council has been talking about, and I'm trying not to put words in anyone's mouths, but what they've been talking about is flexibility to allow this process to be quicker and faster for folks who want to build it. And so by removing the range, because who's to say that you couldn't build 180, building code allows for a 180 square foot unit, right? Studio apartment. Who's to say someone couldn't develop that in a quality way in one of their existing structures or in their backyard? So I think that was the reason for removing the minimum of 200. And then I think the conversation around the maximum is that 1,000 kind of just seemed a little bit picked out of the air. And so instead going to a proportion of the primary unit, to your point exactly, stops it. You wouldn't want it to be, unless there's extreme circumstances, you wouldn't want it to be greater than 50% of the primary structure, because then you start getting into the realm of a two-family, it's just like a two-family parcel essentially, right? So I think that's the conversation that's been had in front of the council in terms of removing those hard foot, like exact numbers, and instead allowing it to be proportional to the primary residence. Because then that's, I guess the thought there was there's many different size lots in the city, there's many different size homes in the city, and so that flexibility might be appropriate depending on your lot.
Yeah.
Here's a thought, just throwing it out there. It might also be worth considering looking into tying that restriction to the actual square footage of a house as opposed to the footprint, because we've already got lot coverage restrictions that should be doing something to address that. I mean,
Yeah, no, in thinking about this, I think you make a really good point, David. So is the thinking by the city that our regulations right now as they relate to accessory dwellings so restrictive that it's disinhibiting people from actually coming before the planning board? Is that really the
I think I think what we did was we looked at other, there's a general movement in ADUs and accessory apartments to try and make the process as easy as possible, because there's so many other hurdles to actually getting these units built.
So then that begs the next question:
Yeah.
are tweaking these provisions relative to minimum and maximum? Because I'm always thinking about this sort of world of unintended consequences.
Yep.
Right? When I think about a minimum, like you mentioned, 180 square feet. There's certain offices that are bigger, personal offices, and they're bigger than that. So,
Yeah.
It gets to the point where, is that really good planning? Is that really something that's livable and something we want to, perpetuate?
In New York State, yeah, I mean,
180 square feet?
you never lived in the city, did you?
No, I did. I've lived in some small apartments, but boy, that's small.
yeah.
So my point is, and then again, with the thinking around what the maximum should be, it being tied to the size of the primary dwelling, it doesn't take into account anything relative to the lot itself and the lot coverage then?
Well, lot coverage would still apply, setbacks would still apply.
Sure, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
So if they want to do something.
I'm just
sorry.
wondering for that reason, so lot coverage would still apply. I mean, there's some calculations that need to go into that, and understanding. Well, I could, based on my main dwelling square footage, build X number of square feet, but then my lot coverage won't allow, so the lot coverage is the limiting factor. I don't know, it just seems more complicated.
Yeah. Well, that is already, the 50% is already a regulation in the code, right? That's already
Yep.
that it couldn't exceed that. So that, I guess that's not a new component. It's the removal of that upper limit of 1,000 being the total max. Right.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
So, how large then how small is too small and how large is too large?
And I
then-
think that the thinking of that is there is already regulations within the New York State Building Code that are dictating what is too small, what is not livable,
Yeah.
right? That's,
And
so I think
that's-
that's the thought. I'm hearing disagreement with it, but
The minimum size thing is a lot more of an issue with, like, if we're talking about, like, historical tenement housing on the Lower East Side or something. If you're putting in an accessory apartment, by definition, you're gonna want it big enough that someone's gonna want to live there. What about, the thing that the related point, question, issue I wanted to bring up was the schedule of regulations for accessory buildings. And it may not be the schedule, it may be that provision in the code, but says that in an accessory building, the upper level will be used for storage only.
the upper level will be used for storage only?
Yeah, there's a height restriction of, 15 feet, but that's gonna be measured based on the average of the roof line between the top and the bottom. Then there's a provision that says that any level above the main level in an accessory building will only be for storage. Now, with that height restriction, you actually could put like a sleeping loft type thing or something like that in. But by my understanding, if this law was simply passed as is, if I turned in a proposal for an accessory dwelling unit that was, say, 500 square feet of floor space, plus a sleeping loft, and was within the height regs, it would get disapproved, because you're not allowed to have sleeping on the upper level. In actual reality, I just erase the bed and put storage space and get it approved, and then I do whatever I want with it. But it might, if the goal is to make it easier to develop accessory dwelling units, opening up some degree of use on the second floor of an accessory building would make sense.
That makes a lot
Some
of sense.
building code restrictions for bedrooms?
No, accessory buildings.
What I'm saying, if you're putting a bedroom in an attic or a second floor,
No, for accessory buildings can't have a second floor for anything but storage. So if you build a second building on your lot, be it a workshop or an accessory apartment or whatever, the second level of that is supposed to only be for storage.
right. I'm not sure of the intent in that. I'm just saying that there are limits in having bedrooms. There are like requirements in building code. That's all I was
yeah.
referencing that change. And also, there are many times exactly what you're saying. People use, call things out as storage space or studies or something like that, and turn them into bedrooms. There's ways to deal with that.
I still think we should hang on to more rather than less architectural review where we can keep it, because I've seen recently approved and constructed accessory dwelling units that are 2 stories. They're similar in mass to the house on the property and the rest of the houses on the block, and they do have a visual impact on the fabric of the neighborhood.
You know, I want to second that, Len, because I find that some of the biggest concerns that the public has about new construction in the city has to do with its appearance and its visual effect on that people can see from the street. And also, I don't know, but I feel like it's not that onerous to go through our architectural review process. I try not to make it, or I think we try not to make it that way. And in some ways, forcing people to deal with those issues early, right, can improve their outcome. You know, I think it's a benefit to everybody for that to, for people to be required to go through that process of knowing what it looks like.
Okay. I just wanted the last 2 points, just because I know we only have a few more minutes, just so you are aware of everything that's in the proposed legislation. There are 3 zoning districts, R110, R1 7.5, and R15, where there's smaller setbacks. They're 5 feet instead of 10 feet. And so in those ones, even for new construction, where the side or rear yard setback of 5 feet is required for accessory apartments, review by the ARB is required if the proposed accessory apartment is less than 10 feet from a dwelling unit on the adjacent property. So it's kind of looking not only at their setback from their property line, but also where's the structure on the other property. And then you would use the same considerations as listed above when we were talking about in terms of window placement, height, things like that.
I think that certainly has some merit because it's taking your context into consideration.
And then the section to J is where it talks about what the building inspector has approval authority over. So currently, building inspector has approval authority over, just trying to remember, currently, Jen, do you remember? In the current code, it's existing, it's within an existing primary structure as long as there's no additions or expansions to the primary structure.
That sounds right.
Right? I think that's, so what's being proposed is that building inspector will have approval authority over all accessory apartments, provided that all setback requirements and provisions of this section are met. Proposed accessory apartments, whether expansion or new construction, that do not meet the setback requirements of this section shall require site plan approval from the planning board. So I just wanted to get through all that so you guys kind
Yeah,
of heard the
appreciate
full range of topics in there.
Thank you. What's the city's timeline on this?
I think they just circulated, they just started circulating for comments from county and yourself.
Pretty
so.
sure they said in the memo that if we wanted to continue reviewing on May 13th, that would be workable.
They are having their first public hearing on April 21st, the council is, but the council understands that the planning board does not complete its review and report until the May 13th meeting. The council has the option of continuing the April 21st public hearing over till May. And
Okay, good. So we
yeah.
can take somewhat of an iterative process. Does it make sense for us, board, to think about sharing our initial reactions based on our conversation tonight? And then continuing the review and the conversation, because they may
Yeah.
take all of that, they may take our points and the,
I think especially the leaning
Public
towards keeping the ARB involved for new construction and historic properties, I think they're going to want to hear that sooner rather than later, because I think that would require some changes to the
yeah,
language
sure.
now.
So let's summarize. I think, and again, I'm paraphrasing based on what I'm hearing by the group here, that, you know, to some degree, when it comes to minimum, maximum, you know, there's, at least from our point of view, and I don't want to put words in our mouth, so help me out here, but there's not much reason, we can't understand why, whether, you know, these changes would actually help to facilitate more applications, and as they're written, I think they're fine as they are. Am I, at least as far as the minimum, maximum, am I stating that correctly?
Just to interject one thing that I grasped from the memo was that their objective overall was to try to eliminate engineer fees for applicants and application fees. So to give you an objective to consider, mull over while you're looking at this, that was what I was reading the memo. I think they were saying that, you know, it could be $37.50 for application, you know, the escrow for review plus the application fee, and that it could be $5,000 to $10,000 in engineers and architects' fees for site plan.
Well, they have
So-
other mechanisms for making sure that the cost of doing business with the city
Right,
is.
but I'm just saying I'm telling you what was in the memo that I read along with the law, so.
And yeah, that's true.
so
I
we're
mean,
looking for
there's a
ways
lot,
to
there's a lot that goes into
eliminate
bringing
that.
applications before this board.
Sure.
You know, and I think when you're talking about larger developers or larger projects, that's all kind of factored into the full cost of a project and those loans and everything that they're getting. When you're talking about a single property owner, a few $1,000s for the engineer to do the site plan, a few $1,000s for the art, you know, like, so the council's also looking at ways like, can we get standard architectural drawings that could be used, you know, like samples of standard architectural drawings that could be used for folks that,
But that aside, it's gonna
Yeah.
cost you $200,000 to build one of these if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So it's still just a percentage, you know, if it's $15,000 in application fees.
Right, but I think that there's an emotional barrier, right, to fees. People hate taxes, they hate parking. There's all these things that aren't really that huge of a imposition, but people don't like them. And
My point ultimately is that there is a way for the city to alter the mechanism for applications and therefore also the cost and the process without also altering the law, right? So there's two different things.
I think it's not so much the application fees, but the fees that it costs to hire professionals to prepare your application to then come before the board multiple times. I think that's what's been discussed as kind of as a creeping fee that we don't necessarily see. We're not seeing the bills. Yeah.
Again, I get that. So, but
Yeah.
the city has the capability of modifying that process and those fees.
They have the
without-
process of modifying the application fees. Their way to modify the process is to remove things from requiring planning board approval and allow them to be just a building permit. I think that's the process
Right.
that they're looking at.
But currently, there's a lot of residences, right, that get planning board, or get building department approval, and they come to the ARB, and the applicant represents themselves. They bring in color samples. They don't need a professional to do that. They can spend, and it's a one visit, they have to wait till 11 o'clock half the time, but, you know, it's not that expensive. And I think it provides a benefit. It's actually a service to those people, I think, in a lot of cases. And we rarely turn people down. But it causes them, like I said, to think ahead.
I agree 100%.
Think about it.
All right, well, we got to get rolling.
Let me
so-
just throw one thing at you, if I
Go
can,
ahead.
really quick. It's based on what the three of it, Lynn and Kevin and I said, or merging this together. The current height restriction for accessory buildings, like I said, is 15 feet, which means if we're talking about a gambrel roof on a 45-degree pitch, it's 20 feet. If we do start to see an increase in the amount of ADUs, particularly as separate buildings, being put up, I think it would be accurate to say that a concern that's been expressed by a lot of people up here and that we're hearing back from the city as well is just, paraphrasing, just because we want to encourage accessory dwelling units doesn't mean we want to let you build some big monstrosity in your backyard. Maybe the height restriction should be redone, and that should be a factor that is tying into whether planning board approval is required.
Fair.
Because that could be kind of a sleeping bear here if this starts speeding up.
Yep, I agree. This sort of world of unintended consequences. So real quickly, Jennifer, do you think you have enough from our conversation to summarize, or do you want us to work with you to
Yeah, I
summarize?
think Natalie was also taking notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think between the two of us,
Okay,
we can get some preliminary comments.
thank you.
And can I add something? I really appreciate the diagrams that came with this, because I'm a very visual person, and it really assists regular people to understand the realities of what's happening in the city of Beacon in a really clear way. So thanks. I hope we, yeah.
Shout out from Kevin. Do we want to take maybe 5 minutes to discuss aquifer?
I think I can just make you all aware of, because it's still being kind of rolled out. So there is, let me see. In September of 2024, Dutchess County adopted a law called, it's regulating hazardous pollution sources in proximity to public water supply sources, aquifers, and wetlands. So there are no regulations currently out there. They're kind of being developed as is being implemented, although it did take effect in October of 2024. The purpose of the law is obviously to restrict and protect residents' water supply sources by prohibiting certain uses or contaminant sources within a certain separation distance from those water supply wells, wetlands, or aquifers. Those uses that are identified as contaminant sources are things like dry cleaning establishments, underground chemical or petroleum storage tanks, gas stations, car washes, commercial salvage operations for vehicle parts, chemical refinery, and then storage of ice control salt and products for ice control. So those are the uses that the Department of Health, who is responsible for implementing this law, is now looking at, and their proximity. So there will be some regulations where those uses already exist in proximity to these water sources, but I think the new thing that municipalities are going to have to look at as they're getting applications for either new water supplies, which we don't see too much in the city of Beacon because you don't necessarily have too many single-family residents with wells or things like that. But where we're placing water supplies or where we are approving these uses, there now is this kind of going to be this distance requirement. So if you are proposing a new dry cleaning facility, say somewhere, they'll kind of have to be doing some kind of analysis to look at whether there's a public water supply within their vicinity.
Yeah, how do they define proximity to aquifer?
Again, the regulations are kind of still
So they're
being,
in process. Okay, well,
Yeah.
that's good to know. I'd be curious because there's a giant aquifer right under the city, so. Right.
yeah. So, I mean, the outline for this is that, first quarter 2025, they're conducting outreach and soliciting input and receiving feedback. Second and third quarter 2025, kind of trying to develop the rules and regulations. And then fourth quarter 2025, doing another public comment period. And then they're thinking by the beginning of 2026, that's when we would have the rules and regulations to kind of implement.
Can't wait.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, great, thank you.